Good morning, and I have been asked once again to try to bridge between last year's Vestry Staff Conference and this year's program, which is, as you know, Reorganization for Transformation. This year, we're focusing on economic justice, nonviolence and gun violence, and reorganization of the church through the best practice research that we have done. And I want to just share this timeline with those of you who weren't here last year. It's the timeline of our past Vestry staff conferences. Briefly, there were two strategic plans that were in place between 2004 and 2011. And in 2009, we had a really big change of direction and conducted parish-wide meetings to seek parishioner input on reorganization. In 2010, we imagined the Church of 2020. In 2011, we took a journey to the new normal, and where we ended our conference with a long list of questions to be answered the following year through our programs. And last year, in 2012, we looked back at what we'd accomplished, but we decided to follow a direction of open discovery and research entitled Learning, Leading, and Growing in the Midst of Danger and Opportunity. Now, it was held right here at Descanso Gardens. Our 2 days were packed with a staggering amount of information. And I personally had 47 handwritten legal pages of notes. And then Kate Gasparilli-Byrne gave me another 37 pages of typewritten notes, and Will sent me 23 pages of his handwritten notes. So I hope that I've been able to distill this down into a syrup for you in some way that you can understand. We had spent a year of really particular volatility with the Occupy movement and an economy that was not recovering. So before we launched into action, we chose to study, discern, and educate ourselves on the complex economic forces that were having such a huge impact on our country and our church. We hope to lay a groundwork for reflection and action by studying the following topics: growth of our parish, the economy, and economic justice. But first, like today, Ed started our day with a sneak preview of his book, with a presentation on creativity and imagination in the House of Love. Ed educated us on one of the major themes of his book, the three brains: the reptilian brain, or the brain of fear, flight, or fight; the mammalian brain, with relational behavior, family, and friendship; and the primate brain, which is the center of intellectual activity and problem-solving, leading, and strategizing. And I'm sure most of you have already done this, but if you want any more of this, you'll have to read the book to find out. The first group that presented last year was our group on economic justice. It had only been formed for a very short time before our last Vestry staff conference, so they were only in the planning stages, but the working strategy articulated last year was: God's justice is available for all people. Therefore, economic justice should be available to all. We need to be better educated about these issues, and we need to do theological work that underlies that approach. So that was sort of their working mission statement last year. Since economic justice is one of the main themes of this year, you're going to hear a lot more about this working group today, or from this working group today. And I wanted to just share some of the programs that have either continued or been implemented since last year's conference in this area. Life and Livelihood still continues with support meetings, still has a coordinator, Irene. She just emailed me the other day about someone in Life and Livelihood who wants to do online business. So she continues counseling and pointing people in the right direction, putting members in touch with each other or with anyone in a position to help throughout the parish. I understand that the unemployed attendee base has changed significantly this year, and we have a lot of sort of chronically unemployed in the group. So we have an unfulfilled as now aspiration to raise dollars to hire an advocate for them to help the attendees navigate social service systems. And Life and Livelihood also distributes a toolkit called Thriving in the New Normal, and we each received a copy of it last year. I thought it was very impressive with all kinds of suggestions for finding work. And we continued our relationship with James Lawson last year. He conducted a Lenten study group on nonviolence, and as the direct result of our involvement with the Occupy movement, he was invited back to do this. Over 100 people were enrolled in this group. Many members also participated in workshops that he led on nonviolent civil disobedience, and I think we're going to be hearing from them today as well. So out of this program, a nonviolent working group was formed and will be presenting today, so stay tuned for that. All Saints has begun the process of investing our endowment income in more socially responsible investments. And through the National Episcopal Church, we're screening out for, I believe it's tobacco and defense, is that right? And we also have moved some of our investments into the Oiko Foundation and the Calvert Group. And we also held a workshop, Mike Pulls held a workshop for our parishioners to educate them on socially responsible investing. And finally, our Rectors Forums have been wonderful, informative forums for all social justice and economic justice issues. The other important, are you seeing? No, you're not. The other important topic last year was to explore the growth of our church. How do we define progress in the growth work? National trends of attendance are down, pledging was down, what do we do? The presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, challenged the church to find new ways of taking the church outside of our doors, and she encouraged us to learn new ways of gathering and serving. Last year, Ed commissioned another brand new growth committee made up of retiring Vestry and who had all their institutional knowledge, and Charlie Riley, who's here, hi, is the chair of that group. At last year's conference, the Growth Committee laid out this list for how they would define progress in growth. And that is to understand, have a further understanding of our growth plan, wider involvement in the effort, including Vestry members who are coming to offer newcomers coffees, discern digital engagement measures and observations from All Saints 101, and increase All Saints media coverage and expression. So what happened from our learnings this year in terms of our growth work? Well, Vestry members continue to assist other volunteers in staffing newcomer coffees. The welcome table distributed 900 informational welcome bags. Production of an intro to All Saints Church video for the newcomers coffee has been made. And the Shelby database cleanup process has started and is hopefully continuing. There's the very, very popular live streaming at 11:15 and all of our Rectors Forum, and this year it was the Christmas Eve services as well. Now, tomorrow you're going to hear a lot more about this when Best Practices Committee presents their case for making this effort even more intentional. And finally, Richard Parker, the professor of public policy from Harvard University Kennedy School, was our keynote speaker. Now, any of you who did not see this presentation, I urge you to go to YouTube video and watch his entire presentation. Our new Vestry members should definitely watch his whole presentation. There's no way that I can, even scratch the surface of all the information he gave us. I'm just going to highlight two topics of his speech, which I think are important to this year's discussion. And that is, I'm going to briefly review his church history, and then I'm going to review the 4 economists who he described have so profoundly affected our economy. And I hope when I'm doing the economy that those of you will correct me if anything is incorrect. Okay, so beneath Dr. Parker's entire presentation was his belief that the church and politics go together. He said, "We live our lives in service to the larger body politic and the idea of the nation as the possibility of creating God's kingdom on earth." This story is very important for us to understand because it is about where we've come from and where we're going. To illustrate this, he pointed out that the Episcopal Church was born out of the Revolution. Half of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglican Episcopalians. 1 in 4 presidents have been Episcopalian, 30% of the Congress, and 90% of the Chief Justices. So all of this political activity was happening while we were never more than 2% of the population. He also told us the story of how literacy in the early church was so critical because we were dependent on our own reading of the Bible. The Word of God was not dependent on the priest, and reason is a gift from God to discern God's purpose. Early on, the Sunday school movement exploded because boys and girls needed to be educated to read the Bible. Women became Sunday school teachers. They didn't have any rights, so they couldn't do much else. And that work led women to develop ideas about the state of the world. They also began to develop organizing and lobbying skills. And in teaching the Bible, women began to talk about troubling things that they saw as inconsistent with Christianity, such as slavery. Bible study became the theological basis for the creation of the abolition movement, the temperance movement, and ultimately the suffrage movement as women began to understand their own enslavement. "I don't have the freedom that I want for others," is what Richard Parker told us women were thinking. At the end of the Civil War, about 1,500 Episcopal women became missionaries going south, teaching newly freed slaves to read and exercise their rights. They realized that freedom could only occur through literacy. During the Industrial Revolution, men, women, and children working 80 hours a day in factories and in mines also mobilized women. So began the social gospel movement. Now, from Wikipedia, I looked up social gospel, and this is the Wikipedia description. Social gospel movement from the early 20th century applied Christian ethics to social problems, especially issues of social justice such as excessive wealth, poverty, alcoholism, racial tension, child labor, inadequate labor unions, poor schools, and the danger of war. Theologically, the social gospelers sought to operationalize the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:10, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." So you can see that historically, the American Episcopal Church has a long history of being at the center of social justice, beginning with the framers of the Constitution. So next was, after this fascinating history, next was a discussion of the economy. Well, first of all, the economists and the economy. Economics and the economy, I'm sorry. So it was very difficult for me to try to distill this down, but I finally discovered that if I just told you about these 4 economists who have actually affected our economy from the time of the very first birth of our country, that it sort of tells the story. So the first economist is Adam Smith. First, he was known as the father of capitalism. He believed in the moral nature of communities, and he believed that in America that you do need the social gospel. He published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, where he proposed that greater economic freedom would create a better system. He conceived capitalism as the opposite of the landed gentry, which we've all been watching on Downton Abbey. It's not very unreasonable. Oh, this quote up here from him is, It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than that in proportion, or something more than in that proportion. Next came Alfred Marshall, the neoclassical economist, in the late 18th and early 19th century. His theories provided the law of a new way of thinking about the economy. His theory was the theory of marginal economics, and it had three principles. Human beings are rational maximizers of their own self-interest. Price balances supply and demand, which is the little chart over on the right. And to achieve equilibrium, markets go looking for other demand if there's not enough in a given market. Then the Great Depression hit, and we think that maybe neoclassical economics are not working. So in comes John Maynard Keynes, who is a radical progressive. He proposes that when the economy dips down, government gets involved by issuing bonds. Is this? Okay, thank you. What? Government then takes the money, invests it in projects, which we now know as stimulus money. Government begins to stimulate the economy, and now you've started the Keynesian multiplier, which begins to lower unemployment and gets the economy going again. And I love this quote from John Maynard Keynes. Capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. The Keynesian period was from 1930 to 1970, and the last president who practiced this theory of economics was Richard Nixon. Now in the 1970s, the Friedman-Reagan era began. Dr. Parker called Friedman the fundamentalist of the economic world in his advocacy for the free market economy. Friedman considered the New Deal to be one step from Soviet communism. Now, Dr. Parker described that in the 20s, managers ran big corporations for their own managers' interests. The managers were oftentimes the owners, and it would benefit their corporation and their employees. But in the 70s, all that changed when the managers' and the shareholders' interests became aligned. Friedman argues that managers should manage for the interest of the shareholder only. His economic philosophy removed the value of the worker and the mutual benefit between the worker and the corporation. This reconstructed the meaning and purpose of the corporation. And here's the quote from Milton Friedman that drives that home. Many people want the government to protect the consumer. A much more urgent problem is to protect the consumer from the government. So you can see that our historic need for social justice is not very consistent with the current economic thinking, and therein is our problem. Now here's the framework for action that was developed at the end of our conversations. We had breakout groups, we had large groups, small groups, and we fired ideas out for what we might as a church do, given all of this historic information and this economic information. So here's, from what I have pages and pages and pages of this, but from what I can tell, these were the key points that came out of that discussion. We should remember our history as an Episcopal church, remember what we've already done and how it is rooted in Scripture. We should become conveners and educators of other churches and form alliances, which I think we've done brilliantly this year. We should focus on education policy. Let's remember those Sunday school teachers. Educate that this is cyclical and things have been worse. It's been a long time coming. We should prioritize advocacy for clean money campaigns, and that definitely came out of Scott's presentation last year. We should promote voter registration, which I know we do, and make sure everyone in the community has a better life because we are here. So I think that's a pretty good list, and I think we've done pretty well to implement that list. So we had transitions last year, which we lost 3 staff members, and our rector wanted to apply these discerning skills to reorganizing our staff. Tomorrow, you're going to hear a lot from the Best Practice Committee about our plans for reorganizing for the future of our church and the new staff. And of course, the Newtown massacre of children and teachers at the Sandy Hook Elementary School sent shockwaves throughout our congregation. Now we look for our church leaders to interpret these events for us through the filter of our faith. So our rector and staff immediately organized rallies and town hall meetings to address the issue of gun violence. Today, we're going to hear from a new task force on gun violence and the partnerships we are forging to bring these senseless killings to an end. As you can see, there are so many things that have begun as a result of last year's Vestry Staff Conference, and we're dealing with endings that will turn into new beginnings. So I just want to close with a poem that I like and that I pray very often. It's a favorite of mine from T.S. Eliot, and I think it speaks to this moment in our All Saints history. What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. T.S. Eliot. Thank you.